Brewing Inc. is now syndicated on SeriousWriter.com. See them at SeriousWriter.com for resources, articles, videos, topical classes, and now a podcast, the Brewing Inc. Podcast, because we're syndicated on SeriousWriter.com.
All right, well, welcome to another episode of Interbrews. So, as most of you know by now on our podcast, we are alternating between sharing stories and discussions with our writers group to interviewing professionals in the industry. And we've done interviews with an agent, we've done interviews with authors, and we'll get into editors and some other people as we get going. And today we have published author Bryan Davis. How you doing, Bryan?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Oh, man, no problem. We met Bryan at the Realm Makers Conference a couple months ago, and your agent is also Kyle Young, is he not? Is that true?
Yes, he is.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
Kyle.
So I found out that we had, an agent in common. He's my agent as well. And especially as we were getting into the syndication kind of partnership relationship that we have with SeriousWriter.com, I thought, well, we've got to get Bryan Davis on there. And a lot of people were really excited to see you at the conference. They were like, they got up early, man, just to talk to you.
Yeah, that was great. I had no idea there'd be that many people who actually wanted to see me that early in the morning.
Yeah, it was awesome, man. And my friend Steven and I, who's also a part of the podcast, we were there and just got to kind of hear your wisdom while we tried to wake up and have some coffee. Bryan has been writing for professionally, 10, 15 years at least?
I've been a full-time author for 16 years.
16 years. All right. And you got started, though. Writing wasn't your first kind of gig. What was your first gig? What did you start out doing?
I was a computer professional, everything from systems analysis, programming, training, database, you name it, I did it.
Yeah. And what did you enjoy that kind of work, or do you still do that kind of stuff?
I did a lot. Kind of a little burned out at times, but it was definitely a good job.
Yeah. Did you get a lot of, can't print, that kind of stuff? Did you get a lot of that?
I was back in the time when there was rejecting punch cards.
Yeah, I remember working with a computer IT guy, and we went to an old lawyer's office, and they had the big. I'm not even talking like the 3.5-inch discs. They had the big record player size discs. You know what I'm talking about? Those floppies.
Oh yeah.
That was anyway. I felt really like I was going back in time, one of those kind of, Marty McFly moments. So you were doing that for a while. And what kind of got you were you always interested in writing and all that kind of stuff?
No, I really wasn't. To me, writing was a good way to further your career in other ways. If you could write well, you could put your thoughts in a coherent fashion and be able to be persuasive and impress your bosses, because a lot of people, especially in the data processing world, sometimes can't communicate well. And the better you can communicate, the better you can persuade people and get plugs and promotions. And so it was good to do. So I wanted to teach my kids how to write because of that.
Wow.
But I thought the best way would be to go with storytelling, because the kids would be more interested in stories than essays and book reports. So we wrote a story together about 24 years ago, and it worked beautifully. My kids loved it. We created the stories together, and they went on with their own stories. So I have 7 kids, and they all went on with it in various degrees. For example, my daughter Amanda, fifth born, she became a published author. She has 3 published books herself. Yeah. So it worked really well. But what I didn't expect was going through this process would ignite a passion in me to write. I saw how powerful storytelling could be. So it went from academic non-story value to seeing how stories can affect people so powerfully.
Yeah.
And that's why I started pursuing it.
Yeah, and I read that you started with a dream about a boy breathing fire, right?
Yeah, that wasn't the story I wrote with my kids.
Okay.
Once I got the passion to write stories, I started going to conferences and reading books on writing because I had no clue how to write stories.
Right.
But then one night, about 2 years into this journey, I had a dream about a boy who could breathe fire. I told my oldest son about it, and he was familiar with my other writing. And he said, "Dad, you should write a story about this boy because then it'd be a lot better than that other stuff you've been writing." And the reason was because he loves fantasy.
Right.
And he knew a boy who breathes fire would have to be fantasy. So we just brainstormed together to come up with the idea of how could a boy breathe fire, and it eventually became the Dragons in Our Midst series.
Yeah. And that was your, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but that was your first published book, right? That was your first published series. Yeah. But that was kind of a long road to get there. Like what year was that when you kind of first had that idea and you started working on that manuscript?
That was about 22 years ago.
Wow.
And it took 8 years to find a publisher.
Wow. And so talk about that journey a little bit. You hear these numbers, and I've heard from, about, J.K. Rowling was rejected by every publisher in the world or something, at one point. I mean, you hear these stories, and so just kind of go through some of that, because this is going to go on Serious Writer, and there are going to be a lot of aspiring writers on there. It's said on the online that you were rejected 200 times.
That was just the postal mail rejections. That doesn't include email rejections. I keep this in my drawer. Your people who are just listening won't be able to see it, but I keep this folder with all my rejections from the mail, and I guess you can describe it to your readers. It's a folder stuffed with rejections that I got from in the mail.
Yeah, that's a good inch or two thick, at least.
Well, I use it whenever I go talking, doing talks with writers. It's sort of an inspiration thing to don't get discouraged. How many of you have been rejected 200 times?
Yeah.
But I didn't have any clue about how to get published. Back then, you didn't email. It was all written. You would have to send in things by regular courier. And but it was still, if you didn't go through the proper channels, if you didn't have an agent, didn't go to a writer's conference, you're still pretty much guaranteed to be rejected if you didn't know somebody.
Right.
It was hard to get through the slush pile, and there was a real slush pile back then. Stacks and stacks of manuscripts in a room. That doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah.
But I just got rejection after rejection. Every time I'd get one, I'd try to figure out what am I doing wrong? Because as you might know, most of them are form letter rejections. They don't tell you what's wrong. So I just kept improving it. I rewrote that first book in the Dragons in Our Midst series 24 times.
Oh my God.
And it changed drastically. So now I look back and I'm really glad that I got all those rejections, because I'd probably be ashamed of it if that first draft had gotten published. In fact, that book's been out 14 years, and I just recently rewrote it and put out its 16th printing is now a rewrite, because I learned a lot. It's the same story,
right?
But I just improved the writing. So we all get better, I hope.
So when you were getting started and going to conferences, like did you just send your manuscript into publishers, just not randomly, but did you do research and send it in, or like what was that process for you? Back
then we had the writer's guides. They still have them.
Yeah. I have
most of them are online, but back then it was just a book. And yes, I would find the places the publishing houses that would want to look at fantasy. Also agents, say 200 rejections. Some of those were agent rejections.
Okay.
I don't even know if there are 200 publishers out there. But then I got advice from someone to start going to writers' conferences, because that's where you get to know people. That's where you network. That's and you can find out. They'll tell you what you're doing wrong. They'll be glad to tell you what you're doing wrong. Instead of getting these form letter rejections. So that was the most helpful thing for me, was going to the writers' conferences. I highly recommend it. It's still the best way, I think, to get published.
Yeah, man, I totally agree. And I had this conversation with Kyle, and I try to tell the people in my writers group the same thing. I try to say, look, I know it's expensive. I know it's a hassle. I know you're going to be, I got kids and a wife and ministry. I got all this stuff
and it's
going on.
And it's scary and intimidating and everything else.
But I have always felt a huge jump in my motivation, my skill level. Yeah, it's like drinking from a fire hose, and like you can't do everything everybody says, but at the same time, you definitely, for me, I get that vibe of, this is who I am, this is what I need to do, and I need to keep moving forward with this and not quit.
And the networking is priceless.
Absolutely.
It's absolutely priceless.
Yeah, and that's where I met, Kyle. I met Kyle through a lot of that stuff, and I met Jim Hart with Heartline. I met a lot of people, and by that time I had written long enough that they were actually impressed with some of the stuff I wrote. Like I had developed my writing style over years and stuff like that. So it's just one thing after another as you go. So did you get an agent first, or did you get published first?
I got published first.
Okay.
The thing is, with A Boy You Can Breathe Fire, dragons transforming into humans, and with the strong spiritual content, the Christian publishers didn't want to touch it because it was too weird, and the mainstream publishers didn't want to touch it because it was spiritual. So I was really trapped there. So a lot of agents were saying, this is just not publishable.
Right.
I got a lot of agents telling me that. So I finally met Dan Penwell, the acquisitions editor at AMG Publishers at the time, and he liked it, and they decided they wanted to do a Harry Potter alternative. That's not why I wrote it, because that's not my thing to be anti-Harry Potter. I wrote it so kids would have a wonderful, exciting story with spiritual value, but that's what they wanted to do. So I said, all right, go for it, and they put it out there, and we've sold hundreds of thousands of copies now, and they're glad they did. It filled a niche at the time because there was no Christian fantasy at the time.
Yeah.
And now there's lots of it.
Yeah. And so as you go through rewriting it, how many times did you say you wrote it?
I rewrote it 24 times.
24 times.
8 years.
Now, did you have like a writer's group? Did you have people that you like corresponded with or kind of traded with, kind of to get that feedback?
I had a critique group, actually not online. It was actually Meet Together critique group.
Yeah.
And I bounced a lot of things off them. And my kids are great sounding boards.
That's awesome. And how old was your son when you told a story about, you told him and you guys brainstormed? How old was he at the time?
He was 13.
That's amazing. Does he feel a lot of ownership in a lot of that now? Does he feel a lot of...
He kind of tries to pretend it was just, a thing we did. But I could tell that he's going, if it wasn't for me, Dad wouldn't be an author.
Yeah.
He's 35 now, and he's a very good writer himself. I think he'll get published.
That's so awesome. So after all the rejections, you finally get published, and it was Raising Dragons, right, in 2004.
Yes.
And did you already have a trilogy kind of planned out, or was that something that happened after you got published?
I did not have a trilogy planned out. The story ended at the end of that book. But when I got the contract, they asked me, how many can you make? I said, as many as you want. So they went with 4. And so I changed the ending to open it up. Instead of the bad guy dying, he might still be alive somewhere, basically. It still ended the story arc, but I left the lurking villain still out there kind of thing. Yeah. So I opened it up for a sequel, and by the time the first book came out, I had the second one written. So it worked out very well.
That's awesome. And just to kind of revisit this, I'm really interested in what you learned. Like, as beginning writers, I know I've had to rewrite, or I felt like I needed to rewrite a couple of my books, right? Before I did much with them, or I showed them, and I felt like, I really need to rewrite this, because you're right. You get a couple years into it, and you realize, man, this could be a lot better. So,
absolutely.
So, at what point would you tell like an aspiring writer or a writer, these are the signs you need to rewrite something, or these are the things that you learned as you were rewriting those stories?
Well, the biggest lesson I learned, I read a book called Techniques of the Selling Writer by Dwight Swain. And he talked a lot about motivation reaction units combined with intimate point of view. And I'd never heard of that before. So I had written all 4 books in the Dragons in Our Midst series. And I was just starting the Eye of the Oracle, which is the first book in the sequel series called Oracles of Fire. So I'm going to try to put this together because I don't know how many of your listeners out there are familiar with motivation reaction units. Most of them have probably heard of intimate point of view. But putting those two together and combining them absolutely revolutionized my writing. And it just made it so much more, I feel like I'm there kind of thing. So I highly recommend that book if you really want to know what those are all about. I'll say it again, Techniques of the Selling Writer by Dwight Swain, Swain. Wonderful book.
Awesome.
So I did a whole lot less telling and a whole lot more, deep intimacy of point of view, and make sure that every single action was motivated, so that there's a nonstop chain of units of motivation, reaction. And if you do that well, it really makes your story come alive.
Yeah. And kind of makes it that page turner maybe that, that people talk about.
Exactly.
Right? And sometimes people don't even know why it's a page turner, right? They say, I couldn't put it down, or I couldn't, and that's kind of like the highest praise as a writer you get, right? Where people go, man, I couldn't put your book down. I was reading it 3 a.m. or whatever.
Yeah, that's why I put glue on it, right?
That's right. That's really cool. And so is that part of why you rewrote? Because it talked about on your Facebook page, you kind of recently went back and started rewriting a work in progress that you have now. Is that part of the same reason?
That's a different book. I rewrote Raising Dragons for that very reason. I wanted to apply those motivation reaction units, intimate point of view. So the 16th printing of Raising Dragons has those lessons applied. The one you read about on Facebook is I'm doing a sequel to a kid's book. The kid's book is Wanted a Superhero to Save the World. So I'm writing a sequel, and I wrote about 6,000 words in it, and the writing was a struggle. I never run out of ideas, but I just came up with this idea is really stupid. It's just not working. It's flailing about like a flopping fish. And so I just got to start over. So I don't have traditional writer's block in that I always have some idea, but sometimes my ideas stink. So I just have to say delete, and go back and try it again. So that's what I did with this story.
And what was it that you had to kind of refocus? What helped you refocus it? Because on Facebook, I saw one of your comments where you said you started rewriting and it felt a lot better. Like what was the refocus that you were able to do that helped you make it feel better to you?
The motivation for the protagonist in his, what we call the object of desire or the target or the goal, it just did not have anything emotionally attached. It was just it's just kind of something to do. So I gave him a goal that was heart-wrenching and would really drive him forward emotionally. So I believe that every goal should have both external and internal motivations. The external is, you got to stop the bad guy from doing bad things. The internal is, how does it affect the heart of the hero? Mm-hmm. You have to have both, and I certainly didn't have the heart of the hero, and I kind of barely had the external one. So that's what I knew I had to start over, because I find if I'm not motivated to write this book, the motivation isn't strong enough.
Yeah, and that's I feel the same way. I'm finishing up a work in progress now, and it has to get to the point for me. Yes, there's a discipline. You got to write. You get up and you force yourself to do it sometimes, but there has to be that internal motivation for me where I want to finish it. I want to know what happens next. I want to know, I want to know where this is going. And sure, you can still revise it later. People give you feedback. So talk for a little bit about that book. One is Superhero to Save the World, because I haven't read it, but it looks really cool. It looks really interesting. Can you talk about that book for a little bit?
I had a blast writing that because I had never written for that age group before. But I remember what my kids were like back then, and they liked really crazy stuff. So, superheroes are big, but I want to do something different. I want to make the kids the superheroes. So my protagonist is a 12-year-old boy who's a genius, and he creates a device that he thinks will give him superpowers. But he's scared to use it because it has gamma rays and all these other things, and it's going to alter his chromosomes. But then his sister accidentally uses it on herself. She's 8 years old, and he comes in and finds her lifting the desk up over her head. He figures out that she used the superhero machine. He says, wow, it works. So he tries to use it on himself. It doesn't work on him. So they become a superhero team where he's the brains and she's the brawn. And they go out fighting this guy who wants to destroy their city with an earthquake machine. And the girl is just so quirky. She's just a doll. She's fun. She's funny. And she loves her brother. But he's also really irritated that she got the superpowers that he didn't. So it's a romp. It's a romp of a story, but still has a very good a lesson for kids. It's the siblings learning to love each other because the brother has to deal with the disappointment. And so they end up being a very strong team and quite the loving siblings at the end. So I had a great time.
Is that more of like a middle grades? Like what age group was that for?
Yes, it's middle grade, 8 years to 12 years old.
Yeah, that's awesome. I was, by the way, just as an aside, I was a little, not about you, but I was a little frustrated because I went to look up some of your books at the library. We love the library in my house. And none of our local library just doesn't have a whole lot of your books. So we're going to have to try to fix that. They don't have any of your books. And I was like,
oh, no. Well, I appreciate you. You're fixing that.
No, we actually have an event coming up where we're having more connections as our writers group in the podcast with the local library. So I'm hoping to maybe fix some of that. That sounds like the kind of book my kids would enjoy and I would enjoy. I think it's it's got a fun twist of, just kind of the character interaction between him and his sister and having to work through some of that conflict. But the most recent kind of trilogy that you've done is the Reapers trilogy. And that one also, is that more for like an adult? Is that a teen or an adult?
Older teens and adults, because it's a dystopian. It's pretty dark. A lot of death, destruction, but it ends up in the light. I have a Christian worldview, so it's going to have hope and light at the end. But it does start pretty dark.
Mm-hmm. And what was the motivation or the theme behind that trilogy with the Reapers?
Well, I've seen a lot of dystopians out there, and Hunger Games, Divergent, Maze Runner, and they're very, very popular. And although the darkness and the dystopia is very interesting, I always felt like it was a big downer. It was always depressing, and there was never victory and success. And so I thought it would really be a great idea to have a dystopian setting and then have victory at the end, so people will be glad that they read it instead of feeling like, wow, that's dismal, and give them something to chew on. So that's why I decided to write a dystopian.
And so when you kind of come up with ideas now, you're already working on the sequel to the superhero book and you've got the trilogy. Do you think now when you get an idea, do you think more in a series kind of mindset, like when you come up with a new idea?
Yes, I do. I always think of a series because people love series. They get attached to characters. They want to see what the characters are doing next. And I know from my fans that they hate to say goodbye to the characters at the end. I have one huge fan that's never read book 12 in the Dragons Intermit story world because she just doesn't want to say goodbye. And that's because it's the last one.
Yeah.
So that they do love series.
Yeah, they do, and then you're right. They don't like the saying of goodbye. I don't like saying goodbye. I have this theory. And we'll see if you feel this way. I have a theory, and I call it book grief. Mm-hmm. I call it book grief. So like when I'm writing a book, and I guess it could go for readers too. But when I'm writing a book, like I've been immersed in this story and these characters for months on end, right? And so when I finish writing, I get depressed. Like when I actually finish, when I go the end, boom, first draft is done. I literally like have this, I couldn't explain it the first couple of times, and I call it book grief. I don't know if you can relate to that at all, but it's like I'm missing these friends that I had every day for the last, whatever.
I can relate to it if I'm in the middle of a series, that I get through book 2 or book 3, and I can hardly wait to get back to the story because I know there's still something open there that I need to do. But at the end of a series, I haven't felt that. If you can imagine, Dragons in Our Midst story world has 3 series, 4 books each. There's 12 books. There's 1.5 million words in this story world. When I got to the end, I felt no grief. I was glad I was done, but I also ended it in such a way that I was satisfied. Said I put these characters in the right place, even though some of them died, as ought to happen in a long series. I was satisfied, and the book ended in a way where I could close it and say, I'm done, and we're all happy. So I didn't have grief. I don't have grief at the end of a series. At least I haven't yet.
Yeah, for me, it's at the end of a book and even the end of a series, like just like you said, just for me, it's more just I miss those characters. Like for me, a big part of writing is that these characters become kind of real to me. It's kind of weird. It's kind of strange, but they become kind of like real people in my brain. So the fact that I'm not revisiting them.
That happens to me too. It does. They talk to me.
Hey, do your characters... Are you more of a, discovery writer, or are you more of an outliner? Like, where do you fall in that spectrum?
All the way to the end on discovery, seat of the pants. I'm a pure discovery writer. I sit down, have no idea what's going to happen.
That's really cool.
So I do a lot of work on the back end, as you might understand it.
Yeah.
So, a lot of editing when you're a discovery writer.
Yeah.
But I love it that way. I want to go on the adventure with the characters. I want to feel the fear. I want to cry with the sadness. I want to exhilarate with the victory. It's fun that way.
Yeah. Well, I'm not totally an outliner. I'm more in the middle. I have kind of an overall story that I want to tell, but I kind of discover how it's going along the way, And the only negative about outlining to me is that characters don't always do what I want them to do. So, and then I have to figure out why they did why did you do that? So you were talking earlier about your fans. How do you kind of interact with your fans? I know you've got the Facebook page, but what kind of feedback do you get from your fans when you write a book and you put something out?
Well, I have an inner circle, a secret group on Facebook of fans that I've met at writers' conferences, at book signings, who keep writing to me, emailing me. So we have a little group, and we bounce things off each other. And these are usually have shown themselves to be good storytellers, good writers. So I know that their feedback is going to be helpful, and they've been great about that. So I guess you might call it a round table, if you will.
Now, do you give them like beta versions of stuff, or do you just bounce ideas, or how does that work?
I do both. I'll bounce ideas, throw a paragraph out there. What do you think of the beginning of this story? Does it work? Does it capture you? If you want to read more, I'll send it. And some people will ask, and I'll send them all the whole work in progress. It just depends on how much time they have. So we do both.
As far as, so at what point in your process, you talked about you got published at the first with the first book, with Raising Dragons in 2004. At what point did you get an agent? Was that like right away?
I got an agent right away in order to negotiate the contract.
Yeah.
And I was told by most of my peers that the agent will probably get me enough to pay his commission at least, and I thought he did a good job. He got me a good contract. But to this day, I've never had an agent place a book for me at a publisher. I've always done it myself. This particular agent tried to place my next series and never could do it. And every single one of my traditionally published novels came from meeting people at conferences. No agent has ever placed one for me.
Wow.
Now I have Kyle, and he seems to be a real go-getter. So I'm hopeful for a change in that, because I haven't gone to many conferences lately. So if he doesn't come through, I might have to go to a conference again.
Yeah. And have you been, so are your books published with different publishers then? Or have you been with the same publisher, or are they kind of spread around with different publishers?
I've had two different publishers, traditional ones, AMG for Dragons in Their Midst and a couple others. And Zondervan did the Echoes from the Edge and the Dragons of Starlight. So 7 books were done by Zondervan, which is now HarperCollins Christian. And 16 books by AMG. And some of mine are self-published. I want to see how that would go. Reapers is self-published because even AMG wouldn't touch that one. It was just too dark. That's what they told me.
Yeah.
So it said it's just too dark. It has ghosts in it. We can't have ghosts. It's going to offend too many readers. So it's I did it myself, and it's worked very well. We sold quite a few. And the superhero story, I did that one myself too, and it's just gone gangbusters. I made a profit in just 2 months.
Wow.
Even though I printed 2,000 copies on the first run, and already made all that money back. So that's done really, really well at homeschool conventions. They just gobble them up.
Yeah.
So the self-publishing's worked well for me.
Yeah. I would imagine, since you already kind of have that sort of fan base built up, that. Oh yeah,
that's crucial. I should do that caveat that I had a huge advantage of having a fan base. So it was easy for me to contact people who would buy my book. A lot different if you're going to self-publishing as a first-time writer.
Yeah,
a lot different.
Yeah, have you built up much of an email list over the years? You talk about homeschool conventions and that sort of thing. Have you built up much of an email list? Is that big?
I have thousands. Yeah. I have thousands on the email list. I have thousands on Facebook. It's been great. So traditional, I think that aspiring fiction writer should go try for traditional publishing as much as possible first. Exhaust all those avenues. Just don't take shortcuts. Don't be impatient. You got to do it. Get an agent or go to the conferences. Don't just take the easy route. Try traditional first. But I know that sometimes it's just not going to work, and you may have to go with self-publishing. Yeah. That's my advice. Yeah. Try traditional first.
You talked about techniques of the selling writer, right? And
yes.
Are there some other kind of things that you've learned, or books or concepts that you like to talk about with aspiring writers to kind of help them as they're working on their manuscripts? Are there some other kind of ideas?
Well, I think Self-Editing for Fiction Writers is a must-have book. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's by Brown and King. Brown is Browne, and King, King. Self-Editing for Fiction Writers. That's a good starter, basic book. Master that book. It's got all the basics that you need to know for fiction. And at the conferences there's just so much to learn. How to start a story is so important. Understand the hero's journey. Most people like hero's journey stories. We're kind of wired for those stories.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Lord of the Rings is hero's journey. Star Wars is hero's journey. Narnia's hero's journey.
Yep.
Know that structure. Know why it works and how to start a story. For example, I tell people, don't start with intense action. Don't start with a gunfight or a sword fight or a car chase or a guy hanging from a cliff with crocodiles down below, because the readers don't care yet. They don't know the characters. I tell them start with mystery. Start with questions that you raise and intrigue. Get the readers wondering what's going to happen next, and have the main character, the protagonist, lead them through the story world to discover it along with the character. And this mystery and the intrigue will keep the pages turning as they get to know the character. And then once they get to know the character a little bit, go ahead, bring in that intense action. By then, they care. So there's a lot of things like that. A lot of that's on my my writing blog, theauthorschair.com. I have a lot of writing tips on how to start a story and how to keep the intensity going. The Author's Chair, TheAuthorsChair.com. Theauthorschair.com.
Good.
And just do a search on that for writing tips, and there's going to be lots and lots of them for you. And if you just go in order from the first writing tip on through, it'll guide you through completing a hero's journey story.
Yeah, you've got Harry Potter, you've got some of these other really kind of classic heroes journey things, and I think you're right. I think a lot of people, I think there's that balance of how do you start a story without so much exposition, right? Because you don't want to just be explaining things to people. I think that's really interesting to just kind of begin with questions.
Just look at Reapers. Go ahead and buy Reapers, everyone out there, and read the first couple of pages, and you'll see that exactly what I'm talking about in that book. How I start out with raising questions and getting to know the character as he goes through pursuing a goal. All right, there's my advertisement.
Yeah. Well, and I think that works well with what you said earlier about the motivation and reaction and those kind of things. Because if you start out with mystery, then, like you're saying, you get to know the character and their motivation along that sort of journey and path. And then once you do get to action, the stakes are there that to pull people in. So that's cool. So other than theauthorschair.com, and what's your website?
DavisCrossing.com, www.davis, that's my last name, Davis, crossing, CROSSING.com.
Obviously, you're on Facebook. Are you on Twitter or other stuff too?
Yeah, Facebook is facebook.com/BryanDavis.fans, BRYAN Davis.fans, FANS. And on Twitter, I'm at Bryan AUTH for author, BRYAN AUTH.
And obviously, you can find all your books on Amazon. And are there any other main ones out there that you like to kind of point people to? Barnes and Noble, probably.
ChristianBook.com carries all of them. They're all in Barnes and Noble. Any retail outlet is going to at least have them available.
I've really appreciated this, Bryan. It's been a great conversation. I know I'm going to get the book, Techniques of the Selling Writer. I know I'm going to look that up and kind of because I've been getting into some of the deep POV stuff myself, making sure I'm practicing that as much as I possibly can. So I think as a good companion to that would be great.
Right, and for your listeners, that book is actually kind of expensive. It's about $20. But the deep point of view and motivation reactions all in that blog, The Author's Chair. Okay. So if you can't afford the book, go to The Author's Chair and you'll find it there too.
Nice. Very cool. I really appreciate it, Bryan. This has been awesome. And like I said, I like the darker stories myself. I like.
Well, you might like Reapers, though.
I think I'm really interested in Reapers, and I like the fun stuff too. Especially, I have kids that age, middle school. I've got a middle schooler and a fifth grader, so I'm going to definitely be checking out the Superhero to Save the World book. That looks really fun. Right. So, man, I really appreciate it. I really appreciate your time.
It was a pleasure.
Thanks, man. We'll see you soon.
Okay.